good morning and welcome to COP26. We're here today in Glasgow at the MDB Pavilion, and we're having a conversation, a panel discussion today on financing systemic climate resilience. My name is Sarah Duff. I'm a principal in the Green Economy and Climate Action Department of the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, or EBRD for short. And I'm joined here today by colleagues who are also working in on the topic of financing systemic climate resilience. Firstly, we're joined online by Michael Mullen from the OECD. Then in the studio here today we have Carlos Sanchez, who's the Executive Director at the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment. We have Annette Mills, who's a in-country liaison in Jamaica between the CCRI and the Government of Jamaica in implementing systemic climate resilience. We'll also be joined later today by Katarzyna Ruzicko from the GCF, and she'll be joining us at about 11 o'clock when she arrives here later today. The topic of climate resilience and systemic climate resilience is something which has been talked a lot about recently, and there's been many high-level events talking about the importance of how we can look beyond just individual projects and individual assets and companies, and how we can try to look at the entire system and how we can make that more climate resilient. And as I said, there's been many high-level events, and what we want to do with this discussion here today is to bring the topic down to the working level, the technical level, talk about practical solutions and how we can actually implement this. And so without further ado, I think we'll kick off the panel discussion. My first question today goes to Michael online. As I said, the idea of systems-based approach to climate resilience is something that's been gaining a lot of traction lately. In order to start the discussion today, could you give us an overview of the current state of play and how you see things from the OECD perspective, and that will help us set the scene for the discussions.
Certainly, my pleasure. So thank you for arranging this discussion today. I'm a strong evangelist for the importance of a systems approach, so delighted to be here. So I think it's worth starting with a bit of context about why is this important. Globally, we're faced with two sets of issues that need to be addressed for infrastructure. Firstly, in developing countries, there's a huge unmet need for new infrastructure to underpin progress towards the SDGs. And in OECD countries, much of the infrastructure is here, but often old, poor condition and designed to meet the needs of the past rather than the needs of the future. Against this backdrop, our expectations for infrastructure are also evolving, not least with the need for decarbonisation, the opportunity of digitalisation, and now, of course, the social changes wrought by the pandemic. We also have climate change. We're moving out of historical experience. We're already at 1 degree of warming with, we fear more to come. So we'll need more infrastructure, we'll need different infrastructure, and ultimately we'll need better infrastructure. So how does the systems approach help with this? Firstly, what is a systems approach? Essentially, this starts by looking at people's need for infrastructure, such as clean water, reliable access to energy, transport. Then it uses modeling tools to examine how does the existing networks perform in meeting those needs against a changing climate. And then thirdly, it identifies, okay, where are the priority investments? What are the priority interventions to bridge the gap between where we are and where we need to be? Whether that be enhancing the robustness of specific assets, investing in new assets, building in redundancy, etc. And so this gives us the following benefits relative to climate proofing. More efficiency, because we can target investment to where it's most needed, and also new opportunities. We can make use of nature-based solutions and other tools rather than just building what we would have built anyway, but slightly higher. So this might all sound pretty abstract. So let me give you a specific example. So in Copenhagen, they were faced with increasing damages from sudden rainfalls. the conventional response would be effectively build bigger drains. Instead of that, they implemented a package of measures that included creating new green space, property level measures, and of course, some new drains. Now, this package was hundreds of millions of euros cheaper than the conventional approach, while also creating co-benefits from the city. Yet I think it's fair to say that there's been a lot of discussion about this, a lot of sense of this is a good idea, yet it remains the exception rather than the rule. And this raises the question, if this is so good, why isn't everyone doing it? And I'd say three main barriers. Firstly, on the technical level, we still are hindered by a lack of data and tools that work at the level of systems rather than individual assets. Secondly, lock-in. We think of lock-in in a physical sense of, once the road has been built, it could be there for, in some cases, 1,000 years. But there's also an institutional lock-in. Our regulations, our financing models, planning policies have all been developed for static climate. And we need to now adjust that to think more systemically about how do we get the services we need in a changing climate. And lastly, fragmentation. By its very nature, it requires working across silos. And as we know, both from our own work and externally, this can be easier said than done. So I think what we need, and again, just to reiterate why I'm so delighted to be here, is we need more examples. We need more evidence of this can work, these are the benefits that it can deliver, and this is how it works in different contexts. And secondly, we need more funding. The systems approach is it's a public good, and this requires public funding to put into practice. And so there's a need, I think, for greater advocacy and greater demonstration for governments and development partners to invest in these approaches. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. I mean, that set a really good introduction to the event today, and I think you mentioned there, you talked about examples, and I think with that, I'd like to go to Carlos. And CCRI have been really instrumental in developing practical approaches to systemic climate resilience, and I know that you've been doing work on infrastructure investment prioritization tools, and I think it would be great if you could give us an overview of that work that CCRI are doing.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sarah, so much, and for the invitation. Wonderful to be here with all of you and everyone online. Thank you very much. So absolutely, and maybe if you allow me, Sarah, let me take a half step back to provide context into why CCRI is doing what it's doing and where we are working, and then I will zoom in into your very question. So CCRI was born under the realization of something that I believe that Michael built up very nicely. That is, in a way, it's a market failure or an information failure. And that is when it comes to physical climate risks, we are making decisions with imperfect information as of how physical climate risk is going to impact our desired outcome. Whatever is our desired outcome, and whatever it is the form of initial effort. It can be financial, but it can be time, or it can be policy. That means very different things to very different actors, and that is how CCRI is structured. It's systemic, and to us a very core working group where we will be talking in more detail just now, but basically helping governments to assess and to manage the exposure of national value to physical climate risk. But then we are also working at the asset level, because it doesn't work, it's for nothing that we prioritize, we understand what are the assets that we need for us to be resilient. But if those assets don't perform in that future state of the world, where frequency and severity of physical climate risk is going to be at a different level as it is today, it's all planning for nothing. And then financing, because we recognize that there is a desperate need for capital to be mobilized now. And for that, there are ample resources of innovation within the global financial industry, public and private, to really mobilize that capital immediately. So that's where we work. Let me bring the conversation to systemic. And I believe we have a very critical actor personally, institutionally with us today, such as Anaite, later will be joined by Katarzyna. The UK government has also played, and Katarzyna is here with us already. So Green Climate Fund, the government of Jamaica, the government of UK, University of Oxford, I would even say Global Center on Adaptation, ACD, played a key role in really framing a solution that speaks to the government's needs, and that is very crucial. We don't want to have one-size-fits-all approach to say these systemic solutions. We started speaking to the government of Jamaica, what are your needs? What is the rationale for action? And that is a crucial one, because what we found there is that the need is for a government to optimize the deployment of fiscal resources for the protection of national value from physical climate risk. So that is a very tough exam question, because basically asking us, can you certify how every unit of fiscal resources is going to be certified to maximize the protection of economic, social, and ecosystem value? So a wide array of very critical actors, some of them are here, so there's no need for me to go into too much detail, but I will finalize by saying that the government of Jamaica is being an absolute leader in this space. One of the considerations that we brought to this broad discussion is the risk of pricing risk. Vulnerable countries, we need capital to be attracted to them, but if you only focus on highlighting the risk alone, you're not attracting, you are scaring capital. So what we want and need to do, and we are doing, is to effectively do that by providing the measure for good management. And that is what comes first, and then we can go into the assessment. Maybe I should leave it there, and then colleagues can elaborate further, but thank you very much.
Sure. I mean, that leads me really nicely on to the next question I wanted to ask to Anaite, was on kind of you're a country liaison with between CCRI and the government of Jamaica, and maybe you can tell us a bit about the perspective of Jamaica and why they wanted to develop this, or what were the intentions initially, and kind of how did it actually work in practice, and what were some of the challenges that you faced when you were trying to implement this new approach?
Wow,
that's a lot.
Big question. Well, no, thank you, Sarah, again, and EBRD for putting together this panel. I have the honor and pleasure to work with Carlos and Katarzyna for almost 2 years now. It's been a process, but to your question, I like what Michael said at the beginning, which is something that Jamaica is very interested about. Obviously, by virtue of sustainable development, there's a huge infrastructure gap in the country. There's a need to invest in roads, in water infrastructure networks, improvements. There's a need to improve the resilience of the energy sector. So there is a prioritization that needs to happen when it comes to investment. That's the first driver of development and the need to invest. The second driver, and something that we have to recognize in the small island states, is that there is obviously exposure to climate change, and disasters can take a huge chunk of GDP. Just in Jamaica, a flooding event that happens every year can represent 1 or 2% of GDP, which when you put it in the numbers, it's difficult to bring it to a perspective, so to a context of average Jamaicans, but we're talking about decreased productivity because people cannot simply get to their jobs, to their places of work. Children are not able to go to school because the main road that they take to this key infrastructure is completely gone because of flooding. And Jamaica is also experiencing problems with salinization of groundwater. So there's a huge urgency to start improving and making investments in the water infrastructure network. And I can speak for days about not only the usual flooding events that Jamaica experiences every day, but we're talking about hurricanes that can represent 30% of GDP, and in a country that has been going through an IMF program to stabilize debt, that is difficult and is it's a balancing act of being able to meet the targets and the requirements of the international community and the financial community, bringing that debt level down, but at the same time making enough space to make the necessary investments into what matters the most for Jamaican citizens. And that's I cannot tell you, I'm not the Minister of Finance, but I have the honor to work closely with Dr. Clark, and that is a very difficult balancing act. And then we're talking about what Carlos was saying. How do we prevent capital flight? Because it's a beautiful island. I mean, I hope everybody gets to visit Jamaica, and it's a beautiful place. It's exposed, but it's worth the investment. So how do we bring that narrative into the investment community, public and private, to say there's opportunities here for good investment. We have to prevent capital flight because the infrastructure is needed, the investment is needed, there's opportunities, but we have to manage risks, right? And last but not least, I think I wanted to bring up the opportunity and the price tag. The governments simply will not be able to absorb all the costs of infrastructure, not only repair, but new infrastructure. So we need to bring the investment from the private sector side. And I think that at least when Jamaica decided to get involved in the coalition of climate resilient investment, the Prime Minister did it with the understanding and the thinking that we need to speak private sector language. We need to respond to the needs also of the private sector. And the private sector needs data, and needs solid data, technical data, and needs to be informed about what will be the different risks and opportunities in making these investments. The challenges, we can talk about it as we move on to Katarzyna, but there's obviously capacity in country. There's data, but it's scattered. So we need to bring that data into and translate it into the type of to inform decisions, and we need to do it in an accessible, easy manner, and that's where the systemic risk assessment tool comes in play.
Okay, great, thank you, thanks. And following up on that, Katarzyna, thanks for joining us. It's great to have you here today as well. And I know that you've been involved in this program as well. How do you see the work and the prioritization leading to a pipeline of investments that GCF and other finances, and EBRD and other, well, not in Jamaica, but we can invest in?
Thank you very much, and good morning to everyone. So just maybe to touch upon what Anaita said, as I said, it's maybe not only that I am talking about challenges, but I would also like to talk about solutions. So yeah, actually, as GCF, we have two major characteristics. The first thing is that we are supposed to be impact investor. We don't have that huge amount of money as multinationals, but we want to have impactful catalytic solutions that can bring first loss peace, that can really de-risk investment that is much bigger. So this is the first reason why we would very much like to see a resilient pipeline to co-finance and to mobilize other institutions to finance. Secondly, is because we are a country-driven organization. So we actually provide readiness and financing for national adaptation plans that can be used by every country. And we thought it would be very useful to bring the methodology that can really make it work. So that it's not only that we provide money for readiness, but we also provide how to do the things. And actually, when we started, and I think it was the beginning also with Carlos, when we started discussing how to move resilient infrastructure, we found out that from the scratch, so from the climate data, through the modeling of risks and vulnerabilities, up to project pipeline generation, there are a lot of gaps. Because the whole world was mainly on mitigation. Adaptation was coming mainly from ecosystem-based adaptation and agriculture. So now if we want to step really to infrastructure on adaptation, we really have a lot of things to fill as the gap. And here I would really like to say that This was super bold decision by Jamaica to be the pilot, and I think if there's the greatest applause, it's really for the country. And I think what was also amazing is that Jamaica was able to put all the stakeholders together. So that's why from the very scratch of data gathering and building the model, we can really talk with public, with private, with all the investors and all the stakeholders in the country. And because of that, we can actually make a pipeline that everybody understands. And at a certain moment, we are going as from the technical side. Now Oxford University will be accomplishing the model. So within this model, we are going to pilot again something that is quite novelty globally, which is really assessing how nature-based solutions, ecosystem-based adaptation can replace hard infrastructure or at least accompany hard infrastructure. And we really will look at the physical strength, and we will look at the valuation of this asset also from side of CapEx, OpEx, and what are the additional benefits of using nature-based solution instead of hard infrastructure. And finally, we'll go to the methodology of project pipeline origination. And what I would like to say, this is not a novelty from the sense of building project pipeline and not separated assets. It was already there, but it was never for climate resilience and adaptation. So looking at this from, let's say, low emission transport or low emission cities perspective, this kind of project pipelines were built around the world. And that what definitely happens once you have a project pipeline that is integrated, you really have money flying. Because the main thing for investors is that you address the risks they have on their lists. Once you address these risks, they are just jumping on your projects because this is exactly what they are looking for.
Yeah. I think that the issue of sort of having that solid pipeline is so important, because this is where when people start to actually engage. Otherwise, it's very much a theoretical conversation, and we can talk a lot about it, but then where do we actually spend the money? Where do we actually move forward? Maybe going back now to Michael online again. This case study in Jamaica is a really good example of a pilot approach and something that can be developed more broadly. You were previously working with the GCA, and I know that they've been doing some very interesting work in Ghana and Bangladesh, which seems to have quite a lot of similarities with this work. So with your GCA hat on, could you maybe give us an overview of how you think those two approaches compare? If I'm looking at the wrong camera.
Certainly. As you mentioned, Sarah, I was with the GCA until February this year, developing the infrastructure and nature-based solutions program. So to start, there's a lot of common features. I'd highlight three. Firstly, the same underlying modeling team. It was based on the modeling work by the University of Oxford. Secondly, a strong emphasis on government leadership and ownership. In Ghana, the work is being led by the Ministry of Environment, Science, Technology and Innovation, with strong support from the presidency on down. And a slightly different set of partners. In Ghana, we were working with UNOPS and the African Development Bank, but the same underlying approach of bringing everyone to the table, but bringing everyone to the table from the very beginning. So to go through the kind of conceptual framework, it's the analysis of what's there, the identification of actions, and then the development of a project pipeline. But we had the people who will be involved in the project pipeline working with us from the very beginning to make sure that the analysis that comes out is still targeted and useful. So I see a lot of similarities. I think the challenge we face at the moment is a lot of this work is built on the same foundations. And something that I'd very much like to see as we move forward and as we go from the pilot phase and the demonstration of this is the possibility, this is the potential, to this is just a normal good practice everywhere, is testing a variety of approaches, and also bringing in a wide set of partners so that we can really make this a very scalable approach. Which is why I'm so delighted that the CCRI have established the Systemic Resilience Forum exactly to facilitate this type of process.
Thanks, Michael. I completely agreed with all of your points, but especially on that last point there, that we really do need to make this type of work more mainstream, and I think the Systemic Resilience Forum is a fantastic way to get more buy-in from people and to kind of spread that knowledge and awareness and see what can be done in other countries. Anite, I wanted to come back to you and ask you, from your experience with actually developing this and working with Jamaica, if you were to try to convince other countries to adopt a similar approach, how would you go about it, and what advice would you give to them in order to kind of continue the work?
I think it's very important, something that Katarzyna said, and it has been the experience in Jamaica, is bringing the partnerships together, bringing different players to the table. And I think one of the first advice that I would, be able to share with other countries is to make it a highly consultative process and bring everybody. It does give you an extra layer of work, obviously, but if you are early and purposeful from the start in involving all the stakeholders, and by stakeholders I mean not only the people that represent the different sectors, but the private sector, the finance sector, the international community, the political level at all levels. In Jamaica, the Prime Minister endorsed this coalition from the beginning, and that has trickled down into different levels in the government. With key players in the Ministry of Finance, in the Planning Institute of Jamaica, at the different ministries and divisions and units. So it has been, everybody has rallied together to make this coalition happen and to make this pilot happen. So that is something that has to happen early in the process. We cannot start the pilot and develop everything and consult it at the end. The consultation needs to happen from start. And another recommendation that I will give other countries that would like to seek getting involved in the coalition will be to look at data and start the process of gathering this data. The problem of many countries, and I will not single out Jamaica on that front, is the access to data. There's limitations. You have to buy data. The data is still scattered, but nevertheless there is good, solid data. So these exercises help you put a magnifying lens into these problems, and perhaps it sparks other solutions. So we're not only talking about a tool that we're developing to look into systemic risk assessment, manage risk, and do what we need to do to inform decision making in investments, but we're looking into a tool that also sparks other solutions that need to happen at the same time. So countries have a toolbox. They can open and say, well, yes, I have this tool, but also this has sparked our intention to improve on data access and improve on building the platforms to different players in the public sector and the private sector to access this data without having to go through different hoops and challenges. So it's a coalition that has brought a lot of solutions to Jamaica, and it's just a pilot. Wait until we move into what Katarzyna was talking about, the portfolio, the prioritization. We cannot tell you how excited, I cannot say or properly represent how excited is the government of Jamaica to look into the prospects of moving to readiness, from readiness to investment to programs to action.
Definitely. And just as a follow-up to that, was there high level buy-in from the beginning with Jamaica, or was it something that you needed to kind of persuade and influence people to get?
Well, Michael, when he started his presentation, he said something that struck me. He said, "I'm an evangelist for systemic risk assessment," and that's exactly what happened in Jamaica. Obviously, the topic of pricing risk in an investment risky country is difficult, is a challenge, but I think the challenge comes from a limited understanding of what we're talking about, and that's where the Coalition of Climate Resilient Investment, the Systemic Resilience Forum, and the interactions with other players that otherwise we wouldn't be interacting every day, bring that expertise, that knowledge, that narrative that will, to a certain extent, reassure countries that what we're talking about is not something to be afraid of, but on the contrary, we need to look at the opportunities, the opportunity in managing risk, in physical risk, and I think that was at first a little bit of the pushback. But as we have interacted with Willis Towers Watson, with the co-chairs of the coalition, we have, created that space to understand more and more what we're talking about from the private sector point of view, which is very important. Public sector policies and creating that enabling environment, that's what we do. But the private sector conversation, when we talk about how are we going to engage, and when you walk around the conference, you hear about it strikes me, people jump to say engage the private sector, but what does that mean? And I think it means understanding where they come from too, and reassuring them that we can develop bankable projects, investment projects that tackle all your needs as well.
Thanks. I'd like to pose a question to Katarzyna now. Obviously, we've heard a lot at COP about the role of finance. It's been quite a hot topic. What more do you think that financial institutions can do to provide the necessary funds for this type of work? And as a financial institution, what do you need in order to be able to support investments in systemic climate resilience?
Yeah, I think I would start maybe from something very systemic in the sense of the governance of financial institutions. And it's both public and private even more, is that everything is about financial engineering and deal flows. But very often, financial engineering, we try to go so fast to have this KPIs for every short term, each year, new KPIs. We only look at the deal flows. It locks us in doing what we already know how to do. If we want to go from, let's say, mitigation, the things we already know how to do, we know what technologies will work, what we really need to do is start to think before financial engineering. You really need to know for what you are engineering. Because very often investors build big equity funds and then they are waiting for projects. And even if projects come, all of a sudden they realize, wow, but this financial system we provided is not working for these projects. It's not working for the system of ownership. So I think it would be really fantastic if we can spread this idea of working together as much as possible on building the pipeline together. And then we all know what to finance, and then we know how to share the burden of finance. And one additional thing that I feel is already happening with several organizations. For example, we have this very close cooperation thanks to Jamaica, thanks to Carlos and CCRI on the level of Caribbean. We already discussed with other Caribbean countries, because if we have more countries, we can really build a platform for a lot of institutions to finance. But we also have this very similar advanced discussions with Asian Development Bank, because we also did very similar exercises in Jamaica. We were just comparing the methodologies here in COP like to see where we are today, and we are exactly on the same page. So we also start discussing, can we do it with Pacific? Can we link Carlos to Asian Development Bank so that we all start talking together? And we very much hope that also Africa will have a champion, a leader to jump on with us. I very much look forward to Ghana. I know this great job that Michael did there. So I think the message would be, let's work together the more we can. Let's not wait until the financial engineering comes, because then you may be surprised, you may not understand, and it will take much more time to crowd in finance. If we are all working on the project pipeline and we understand and we really shape the pipeline for all of us to finance, we will be doing it much faster.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, especially even as well in the EBRD region, I see a lot of potential for our countries of operation in doing similar types of work, and especially in our countries of operation, there's many countries that have large long-term infrastructure needs, and I think that's where the opportunity is really.
It's also that deal flows will never work for what we do, because resilient infrastructure is, as we talk about it, systemic risk. Systemic risk brings systemic failures. So fixing one asset in the water system, making resilient, is still not making it work, because with the next hurricane or next storm surge, actually the whole system collapses, and one resilient piece is not going to make it.
Yeah, I completely agree. And because as an institution we work on individual investments and we try to make those resilient, which is of course good. There's not a negative thing to make our investments resilient, but those investments are all part of a bigger system, and we need to make sure that we're looking at that whole system and that we're supporting our countries of operation in developing that as an idea. Carlos, there's a lot to be done in what we're talking about here today and all these challenges that have been brought up. How far do you think that the work of CCRI and GCA and others can go in addressing these issues that we're talking about, and what other specific things do you think are needed?
So that is where the real element of ambition needs to be properly framed, because of course, and that has been alluded by our fellow panelists, solutions are great, research are great, data is great, but until we don't see the real investment, we haven't succeeded. And we need those investments, as it's been coming very, very clear, to both deliver resilience, but also they need to consume resilience. They need to be resilient themselves. And we need to mobilize capital in a scenario of lack of real full incentives as of bringing that capital and informing, not investments. And another point that is being perfectly built priorly is that investment in resilience is not a binary decision. It's not the asset exists or it does not exist. It's really a qualitative decision. This asset needs to be proven to be delivering. And as of today, that is a market failure that we bring some experiences from investors, that they say that they see resilience not only not being recognized, not only not being rewarded, but actually being penalized. And that is what the first urgent need that we need to work on, because some investors say, when I increase my initial capex to 1% above business as usual, I'm only penalized because cost of capital is not compensating for that, and my cash flow model does not reflect that properly in terms of OPEX, revenue, depreciation. You can go on and on. So we need to address that, but I think that jointly we are doing that. And with the solutions at the systemic level, the work that Michael is doing, that GCA has been doing, Green Climate Fund, amazing work, Jamaica, EBRD, we are all really moving in the right direction. And I really like the point that has been made too, that is about consistency and comparability, because we need to come up with a system that allows us to compare apples to apples. The systemic resilience solutions need to be bespoke, and that is a critical and negotiable consideration that need to respond to the needs of a specific government, but systemic resilience measures need to be comparable across the board so that we can inform IMF discussions, that we can inform World Bank, that we can inform wider capital allocation discussions. We need to move towards capital deployment very quickly, and we don't have time to really come up with the absolute perfect solution. We have something that is rigorous, that is robust, and that can already address, even if partially, this market failure. So we need to move quickly from, let's say, getting the physics story right or the science story right, so how exposure is going to evolve, getting the financial story right, so how do we translate the science into financial materiality assessments, and then we'll get into the incentive story right. But in between, we need to mobilize capital now, and that is where the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment has already started discussions about the leak of investment funds for resilience. That is a series of investment vehicles with collaboration with public-private investors that has a commitment, a consistent commitment to integrate CCRA solutions, and that in addition will benefit from some other considerations that will help that capital be mobilized to where is most needed and most urgent.
One of the things that Michael mentioned in his opening discussion was around the fact that many of the same players, in terms of having the technical abilities and the technical knowledge, are doing the underlying work. How do you think you can get more expertise, other consultancy companies, other institutions engaged in and building that knowledge?
I believe that it's about true, genuine collaboration across industries, sectors, and institutions. And thanks to the institutions here, but I must extend also to 120 members of the coalition across pension funds, asset managers, rating agencies, engineering, banking, insurance, risk analytics, consulting, and the list goes on and on. They are really working towards something that is genuinely impactful. And it's been difficult because we are talking about things that have a commercial value, and that institutions may think, oh, I could do that myself, but the answer is no, because if we don't have the buy-in from the system for something that addresses a market failure and something that is a public good and something that is open source, we will never get to that point of buy-in. And to your point about institutions working, I think that I would divide that into initiatives and then experts working. And it's a real privilege to work in the resilience space, because I really think that we all understand that we are very few compared to the mitigation space, and that we really need to work jointly and in a truly collaborative. So GCA, the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, and other initiatives where they bring a component of resilience, we are working really, really together. And the Systemic Resilience Forum it may be a crystallization of that, and we always say we don't want that to be necessarily CCRI. This is a collective resilience-based systemic resilience forum. We have 50 institutions participating there that ranges from 7 countries, 15 international organizations, 22 leading experts in the fields of climate risk analytics, engineering, network modeling, economic modeling, software development, all working together, and then financial institutions that have that element of blessing into what is going to happen. And we believe that that space is going to deliver something, and we want to scale these solutions, position Jamaica as the leader that it is as a country, but other countries to come in. And this is what is genuinely exciting, is that it's not limited to non-OECD jurisdictions. We have OECD jurisdictions really interested in piloting and adopting this going forward. I will finalize by saying that we were really honored that the Secretary General of the UN, just a few weeks before COP, he sent us a letter, basically A, recognizing the leadership of Jamaica, but B, in a way endorsing and blessing this group to say you need to raise ambition. We want you to really bring the systemic resilience solutions to 25 countries by end of next year. We are moving. We want, but additionally capital, and he said, well, you need to mobilize 10 billion in capital for resilience, relying on systemic. And it is wonderful pressure, but we really think that we're working towards that.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting actually to see that the knowledge and the experience and the leaders have been countries like Jamaica, Ghana, Bangladesh. And I wanted to go back to Michael and say, in your opinion, do you think that the OECD countries are interested in learning from this experience and having a kind of knowledge exchange, and kind of, are they talking about it as well? What's the feeling?
Yeah, no, very much. And in fact, I'm pleased to say that OECD joined CCRI a week or so ago. So we're very much interested in this. And I think breaking down a sort of the OECD, non-OECD divide will be important, because this is a collective challenge. There are, of course, differences between different country contexts, but at the same time, given the urgency of what needs to be done, we really need to be working, as Carlos said, in this spirit of collaboration and openness. And amongst OECD countries, I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the work being done by the UK's National Infrastructure Commission, which has been quite pioneering in this space. So there are good examples to share, and I think there's also learning to be brought in, because something that struck me recently was we published our Green Recovery database, which was showing the use of COVID recovery funds, and less than 5%, or maybe not less, but like more or less 5%, was for adaptation. Similarly, with the US's infrastructure bill, there's about 5% of resilience measures in there. And I think collectively, as a community of people who want to move forward on this, we need to be on the front foot, and we need to be proactive, so that when the opportunities come up, we're not saying this is complicated, it's difficult, we'll have something in 5 years' time, but the work's already been done to build those partnerships, to establish those needs, to then identify here where the opportunities will come. And certainly it's something that we're looking at in OECD, and very keen to be part of this collaborative effort.
Thanks, Michael. I think one question, it's a point that's been raised by several of you here today, that there's adaptation has always been small in comparison to mitigation, and mitigation has always been easier than adaptation. And I think this is something that we need to address. What, as a panel, kind of, how do you think that we can go about that? Do you think it's something that we can do more together with mitigation initiatives that are happening, or do you think we need to be more forceful? Carlos?
Well, it's a critical consideration, and that figure comes time and time again, and it's important to bring into the table the discrepancy and the imbalance of adaptation, resilience versus mitigation. I always think they are so different animals. In resilience, to some extent, our goal is to eradicate the word resilience. An ideal world in 5 years, you don't speak about resilience investment because all investments are resilient. We are talking about a risk and about our ability to integrate that risk in our decision making effectively. You never do it perfectly. But once you do that, as with many other risks, you're just doing what you need to do. So it's not a resilience specific. It is about integrating a risk and making sure that your decisions properly capture the impact of that risk into your desired outcome. So it is true that the discrepancy is real, but it's also challenging to say, what is the quantum of resilient investment in a project that we could deploy? We are talking about retrofitting investments, or we are talking about greenfield. So it's just incremental investment that makes the asset resilient, or is the entirety of the capex? We have that question, and we have been working with the Climate Policy Initiative, and they're absolutely excellent work in mapping climate finance, and that is one consideration. What is a resilient investment? Is it the above business as usual, also what an actor would do, or is the entirety of it? So we are struggling with that because essentially it's a very different type of investment. And we could boil it down to also terminology and adaptation and resilience. Just for mental sanity purposes, we always talk about adaptation being a process, resilience being a capacity, and adaptation being a process by which a system from impact to impact improves its ability to not be so deformed by an impact and return to pre-impact form as quickly as possible. But it's kind of a very kind of physics definition. So we also need to work on that to then adjust what comes after that. But I think that in any case, and even if it sounds a little bit theoretical or philosophical, these are important discussions because we struggle to communicate in the resilience space so much, in part because people outside of this space struggle to wrap their heads around what do we mean with an investment in resilience, what is effectively, as compared to mitigation, okay, you have a solar plant, it's from A to Z, that is investment. In resilience, it's difficult. So I think that while keeping the focus on the urgency of bringing capital, we should not forget that kind of baseline, more fundamental philosophical discussion, because it's actually important.
Yeah, we need to use the right language to bring people along with us as well, like you say, because I mean, we often have a discussion, especially the MDBs, about what is the difference between adaptation finance or resilience finance versus development finance, or just good practice, and there is no real business as usual anymore because climate change is happening. So
we're in the sidelines. We're at the sidelines of the climate negotiations. So Jamaica and I will take the position of the AOCs, the Alliance of Small Island States. Adaptation and resilience is a priority for the country, and to be able to mobilize the type of financing that countries need for adaptation, we need to, as Carlos said, start to changing a little bit the narrative of what needs to be the good practice. But at the same time, also we need from the international community, from the financial community, to look into, I wouldn't say relaxing requirements, but we have to have this conversation about impact, about adaptation impact, because it's not as easy as, it's not theoretical for islands. So if you want to prove impact results when it comes to adaptation financing, it takes time. And it's, how do you measure it? It's not like mitigation, So it's this difference of mitigation and adaptation is starting to become a little bit of a exhausting for countries, if I can say that. So I think this type of spaces, coalitions, different players start changing that narrative into resilience, best practice, this is what needs to be done. Stop thinking so hard about the impacts or the indicators for adaptation, because it's not easy to measure. It's not easy to measure, but at the end of the day, what we want is to impact lives and protect lives in islands and developing states and vulnerable countries, which we're all heading to be, all of us. So I like, and in that sense, I like what the Green Climate Fund brings to the table, because, for example, Jamaica wants to really understand the value of natural capital, how to bring that value of natural assets, make that combination of green to gray infrastructure, make that replacement if possible, and fully have an understanding of the national assets to make these investments more, I wouldn't say green. I don't like to say green, but make these investments sustainable. At the end, countries like Jamaica are still grappling with development. And when MDBs and financial institutions require to make that difference between what is development and what is resilience, how do we prove that additionality? How do we prove that additionality?
I think that also goes back to a point that Katarzyna was making earlier about the KPIs that we use in banking, and I think it's something that we've been looking at in EBRD, and we try to assess what the outcomes from our investments are, and perhaps it's something that we should be doing is looking more at the qualitative measures of what we're delivering.
Just to add on the discussion, adaptation, resilience, mitigation, I think there are 2 points. One is that we as GCF very much try to look at this cross-cutting, but we also try to look at this for a sustainability of the investment. So actually, if you look for this, it's very much engineering aspect, like engineers work, because normally you have to make the infrastructure, any asset resilient before you can use mitigation in the sense of, let's say, solar panel. Because it's like very simple example, if you have a roof of the building that is not sustainable and it's not resilient against climate hazard like heavy wind, then installing a new solar panel on this roof that will be flying within the next hurricane doesn't make sense. So that's why the first message we try to address through this methodology is that there is only certain moment when you do actually very good check of where mitigation can come and how it can come, not to break resilience. But in addition, actually mitigation aspects can work for resilience, because example given for Antigua and Barbuda, we used new solutions on energy storage to actually have additional generators in case disaster comes. So with mitigation, you can build resilience, but using differently this kind of solutions.
Totally agree. I mean, it's been a fantastic conversation with everyone here today, and I think we're kind of running out of time, and so we might want to start to wrap it up. And so just from my perspective, from the EBRD, I think that I see a lot of potential in our countries of operation for this type of approach, especially in the countries where we have a large, countries with large infrastructure needs over the longer term. Because this isn't something that we need to be looking at short term of which projects we're going to finance this year or next year, but we're looking much further into the future in terms of how are our countries of operation developing. And I think there's a lot of potential for this type of approach to be used in EBRD countries of operation. And what I took from the discussion today was that this strong engagement with the countries is really needed. And that is something that at EBRD we do well at country engagement. We have a lot of people working in the countries, and I think that if we can get the buy-in from the highest levels, and if we can have the work together with all the different organizations here and with CCRI to build that persuasive arguments and sort of explain the benefits that this approach will bring and how we can also crowd in more private finance. I think that if we can get that buy-in from people and cooperation between ministries, I think this is something that we really need to focus on to deliver it. And also then the third point that I kind of noted down was the technical data underpinning the work is super important, and that's something that we need to work on in kind of analytics and climate analytics that are available in the country, and how we can also develop the market for that within our countries. Just in the couple of minutes that we have left, I'd just like to go to each of you in turn, maybe starting with Michael, to see what was your one sentence key takeaway from this discussion today.
Oof, that's we're getting there. That's that's a sentence in that I think even in my own career and kind of working on this for the past 10, 12 years, a lot of my job has been to say, and resilience is also important. I think at this COP, we're seeing the recognition at every level that this is something we need to do. And now what we're doing here is really setting forward how we do it. It's really very inspiring. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Carlos?
I would say that we are progressing towards a full paradigm shift in terms of resilience. Away from resilience is about costly, tedious, safeguard-related aspects, to being a source of competitiveness, edge, and being aligned with the future.
Annette?
Carlos always takes exactly what I was going to say. He does it all the time, every time he speaks, I'm like, he just said what I was going to say. But I'm pleased to say that I was thinking along the same lines, my sentence, and I was thinking about these partnerships, about our work with the University of Oxford and climate analytics, with the Green Climate Fund. So obviously it came to me immediately, partnerships. So partnerships for a new frontier in climate resilience. That's my.
Yeah, I very much share this opinion. So maybe I just add that let's use our technical assistance. In GCF, we call it readiness. In other organizations, technical assistance, to really make this methodology flying for as many countries as possible and give the countries ownership after the technical assistance is accomplished.
Perfect. Well, thank you all. Thank you all for the very interesting conversations. And yes, thanks for everything here today. Goodbye.